Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. I'm Melissa. I'm the membership director at the Harmonie Club. I'm so pleased to see so many members logged in for our virtual session tonight, Making Monte Carlo, Inventing the Jazz Age Riviera. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, I will be muting everyone during the presentation. Please monitor your muting so we can be respectful to the presenters who are logged in tonight. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the program using the chat feature in the Zoom toolbar. We will monitor the questions and do our best to answer all of them. We will also have time at the conclusion of the presentation for a Q&A. Feel free to keep your video on or off, whatever you are comfortable with. This session is being recorded. As always, I encourage members to stay informed with the Clubhouse happenings through our e-newsletters and staying up to date with our events calendar on our website and mobile app. Tonight's program features Mark Braude and generously sponsored by our newest Harmonie member, Cindy Hoddison. Enjoy. I'm going to hand it off to you and Cindy.
Good evening, everybody. Bonsoir à tous et bienvenue à Monte Carlo. It is with great pleasure that we have Mark Braude joining us tonight, and I've had the pleasure to know Mark for some time, at which time he shared his insights into the making of Monte Carlo with some journalists over the past years. Mark is the author of two books of nonfiction. His most recent one, The Invisible Emperor, concerns Napoleon's 10-month exile on Elba and was named coup de coeur title by the American Library in Paris, Best Book of the Year by the Oregonian, and a nonfiction favorite of the year by the Seattle Times. It's been translated into a number of languages, including Czech, Dutch, Spanish. And this evening, we're going to be focusing on Mark's first book, The Making of Monte Carlo, which was published by Simon & Schuster back in 2016, and it chronicles the rise of the world's first casino resort. I'm sure you're curious to learn about that. His writing has also appeared in the Globe and Mail, the Los Angeles Times, and the New Republic, amongst other publications. So I'm going to let Mark take it away and share fascinating stories with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Can you all hear me okay? Great. I don't know if it comes across via Zoom, but this is my costume. I grew this big shaggy beard, which my wife hates, and wore this old sweater to try and pass as a 1920s French fisherman. So as I said, it's my effort, and I'm trying to dodge the light here. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Cindy, for that generous introduction. Thank you, Melissa, Antonio, everyone, for making this happen and come together. And it really means a lot to me to see so many faces. I think it might be the most faces I've seen in one place in a very long time, and I appreciate that. It strikes me today, in keeping with our theme toward Halloween and the costumes, that I'm really, in talking about the Riviera and Monte Carlo, also talking about the idea of glamour. And glamour is a really interesting word. It has an old Scottish etymology going back centuries from the word grammar, which doesn't mean, in this case, conjugating verbs, but actually enchantment, spell casting. And specifically, this is a feminine set of knowledge. They would, certain women with a certain set of intelligence and certain spells that they knew could enchant through their glamour. So I want us to keep that in mind when we talk now about the glamour of the Riviera and the glamour of Monte Carlo, this idea of enchantment coming from some sort of intelligence, calculation, trying to get what you want, and that it is the domain of intelligent women. I'm going to speak a bit about the Riviera in general, and then the history of Monte Carlo, and end in the 1920s with an American named Elsa Maxwell, who's near and dear to my heart. And I also raise a toast to all of you. I was so thrilled to be invited, and thank you again. Now, I can't be in New York with you, but what I can promise is a story that starts with New Yorkers, because as you know better than anyone else, anything in the world having to do with culture, innovation, beauty, and excitement will in some way, I think, connect to New York, the greatest city on earth. And so here we have two New Yorkers in 1922 on a beach in Antibes is where we start, not in Monte Carlo, but down west along the Riviera, along the coast. Antibes at this time, we're talking 1922 July, is a very quiet place. It's a fishing village. There's no real tourism to speak of. There's one hotel called the Hotel du Cap, but at that time, it was a very modest affair. There's one movie theater that plays one movie a week. They switch the phone lines on for a couple of hours a day. It's mostly fishing families. And certainly in the summer, it's just about dead. Okay, so these two Americans who are there are fairly unique for being there. Their names are Gerald and Sarah Murphy. And if you're looking for a golden couple in the 1920s, this is about as close as you can get. They're very wealthy, good-looking, charming folks who come from prominent families, each of them. Gerald is going to be groomed to be the heir to the Mark Cross leather goods fortune, and Sarah is from the Weborgs, an Ohio family who owned, at the time, I believe, the largest estate in East Hampton. So they're really set in their 30s, that we're talking right now, to take their places at the very top levels of New York society. And they spend this summer in Antibes with their friends, Cole and Linda Porter. Cole Porter at this point is not a household name. He's a college friend of Gerald's from Yale. So you say, okay, we've got 4 Americans on a beach in 1922. What's so fascinating about that? The point is that they're not only the only Americans in Antibes, they're probably the only tourists, certainly in that town and for a large stretch along the Riviera. Nobody is going there in the height of summer. People, as Cole Porter would recall in his memoirs, people thought they were crazy for being there. It was just too hot. That has to do with European attitudes towards water. For centuries, the Europeans thought that the ocean was really a dangerous place, a place of chaos. Nobody wanted to go swimming for pleasure. And to sit out in the sun getting a tan would have sounded to most people like a form of torture. That wasn't something you did for fun up until 1922. And that's precisely why the Porters and the Murphys are there in this little town. They like to go to places out of season. They like to have the sense that they're discovering something. They like to be away from the people who would tell them what is fashionable, where to go, and when. So they have this little villa next to the shuttered Hotel du Cap, because the Hotel du Cap closes for the summer. And they take a little gravel road down to this stretch of sand that's covered in seaweed. It's about 20 feet wide. And Gerald and Cole Porter rake it clean of debris, and they find this pristine beach underneath and the Mediterranean out in front of them. And for Americans who are used to seeing boardwalks sort of built up with hot dog stands and rigged carnival games, this is really something quite thrilling to behold. So what they do, and I'm talking here about Gerald and Sarah Murphy, this young couple, is they ask the hotelier, Antoine Sella, an Italian gentleman who ran the Hotel du Cap, who lived in Antibes, would he open the next summer for them? And quite amazingly, he says yes. Amazingly, because he's never done it for the 30 years he's owned the place, and he's essentially devoting his entire staff of a mid-sized hotel to one couple who are paying regular rates. So he's going to lose a bundle. But he knows, or he predicts, that something's going to come from this. The Murphys are American, they have money, and they have style, and they're very charming. And if they're going to do this, Sella, the hotelier, is betting others will come. So the next summer, we're now talking 1923, July 4th, they arrive again in Antibes, and they set up in the hotel. And throughout that summer, indeed, some luminaries come to visit them. Pablo Picasso comes with his wife, Olga, his mother, and his son. And they very much enjoy the surrounding. If you've ever seen Picasso's beachside scenes with these sort of Grecian-looking goddess figures, those are based on Sarah, a lot of them, and his time at the Hotel du Cap. He drew a lot of the sketches for this on Hotel du Cap stationery. Gerald himself was an aspiring painter and painted very well. He painted about 12 paintings that we know of. One of them you can see in MoMA. And by the end of that summer, Gerald and Sarah Murphy decide this is the place they want to be. They want to stay here in Antibes. They had been in Paris previously. They'd left America 2 years before, and now they want to settle in this very quiet fishing town. Now, I would assume some of this story of Americans particularly in Paris, Americans in Europe in the 20s. And there's, we try to get at why they wanted to come. And the simplistic reason has always been prohibition. These are people who wanted to party, and it was hard to have a party in America under prohibition. And that's absolutely just not the case. Indeed, there was prohibition, but it wasn't hard to get a drink, and it certainly wasn't the reason why people left. There was a critique among people who were in the arts, who were culturally attuned, who were interested in intellectual pursuits, that America, after the war, had somewhat lost its way, had sort of lost its cultural soul. This was the critique at the time, that America, having evolved as a superpower, had morphed into this real industrial giant, and that all anyone wanted to talk about was possessions. Gerald said all anyone wanted to talk to him about was the new model Ford versus the new model Cadillac. And he and Sarah, in their letters together to each other, celebrated what they called the simplest, bottomest things. They liked friends and family, food and drink, entertaining. And they thought that they would find that in Europe. The writer Malcolm Cowley, who's a very famous expat writer in the 20s, called it salvation by exile, the idea of salvation by exile. And it's, maybe a misguided belief, but a belief nonetheless that life in Europe would be different and better. That even though France in particular was a very modern nation and they'd just been through this industrial war, that life somehow there was unsullied by the things that were happening in America, that life took place at a slower pace, that people were more interested in the arts, etc. I think that you have some restless souls who are looking to go somewhere else, and they're aided by finances. Okay, the Murphys lived on trusts, and the franc was very weak against the dollar throughout the 20s. So if you're living on a trust, your money can just go that much further in France. But we have to realize that they're leaving a lot behind. They're leaving their position. Gerald is leaving his future, in a sense, his business, that the family completely disowned him in a sense, or looked down upon this move. They had a beautiful brownstone on 11th in the village. This is before the days of Magnolia Bakery, but still an impressive part of town nonetheless. So there was a lot they left behind. And they set up in Antibes. They eventually build their own villa there that they call Villa America. And it's painted quite beautifully. There's little stars and bars out front with a big white star stylized. And they invite all sorts of folks to come join them down there in Villa America throughout the 20s, including Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Zelda Fitzgerald are mainstays. They're really there for quite a lot of time. And they soak up the energy of this place. And I think that's why, aside from the sort of anecdotal interest of this story, is why I'm interested in this moment of Villa America in Antibes, is what they do there and how that then trickles out and influences the rest of the Riviera and indeed the rest of the world. So what they do there is they have a really good time. And they take that seriously in a sense. They practice lifestyle. They're sort of inventing the idea that how you live, how you enjoy life is going to be more important as a social marker than any kind of achievement in finance or even in art, that the art of living is the most important art. So they're doing things like having these elaborate picnics that they'll take down to the beach in costume. This is 1924, 25 by now. Gerald is practicing yoga on the beach. They're introducing the idea of a sporty, easy lifestyle with them to France. And they don't dress fashionably for the times, but the way they dress does get picked up by high fashion as a sort of very chic way of living. Gerald finds kind of a little thicker of a band of the marine sweater that the fishermen wear, and linen pants and espadrilles, and he makes that his uniform. Sarah wears backless dresses with her trademark pearls that she wears backwards because she says her pearls need to get sun and they need to suntan with her. And in a sense, they also introduced the idea of suntanning and swimming, because Gerald will swim every day in the Mediterranean. So that sort of trickles out. People are seeing this. They're interacting with the locals take kindly to them. And what I love about this moment is that everyone's welcome. Indeed, you have to have the means to get there, but once you're there, everyone is accepted. So you'll find people from Hollywood, from the French movie industry, mixing with people who are from finance, people with titles, people from the demi-monde, from the sort of underworld gangster types. As long as you're interesting, you get invited to the party at Villa America. And after all of this stuffiness that they're leaving behind, it's a sense of freedom. So we talk about the lost generation, right? And I don't know if that's necessarily the right word. I mean, I think that these people are haunted. They're haunted by the war. They're haunted, in fact, by the Spanish flu, which sometimes gets lost in these stories of 1920s and the wake of World War I. The Spanish flu, which killed more people than the First World War. And there's a sort of survivor's guilt, and there's a heaviness. And I think that when we talk about this idea of the lost generation of the flappers, the 1920s, and it's all go, 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 you have to realize that there's some pain, and there's some hauntedness that people are dealing with and expressing through the way they live. And a concentration on sand and sun and fried chicken down at the beach takes on a kind of special meaning to these people. And I think, as I say, it sort of changes how Europeans are approaching social life. Okay, so there we have our Americans. Let's leave them in Antibes for now at Villa America. Although I will say one more thing, sorry about that. If you've ever had a chance, or if you get the chance, please read Tender is the Night. It's a novel, I think one of the finest maybe, by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And it looks back at this time in Villa America, in Antibes. There's a golden couple called the Divers, Nicole and Dick Diver. And people say, well, that's Gerald and Sarah Murphy. In fact, it's sort of a mix of Gerald and Sarah Murphy and F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald and their sort of psychosexual dramas all wrapped up in one. But there's a great scene early in the book where a young American actress is in front of the Hotel du Cap, which by now has a sort of semi-legendary status. And they're on this little beach in Antibes. And this American actress, Rosemary Hoyt, asks the divers, who are the stand-ins for, let's say, the Murphys and the Fitzgeralds, do you like it here, this place, meaning Antibes? And somebody answers on their behalf, and they say they have to like it, they invented it. And I think that's very apt, that in fact, if you wanted to look for the invention of a summer season on the Riviera, you would do worse than starting with those two Americans in Antibes and the idea of an invention of something new. These things have to be learned. You know, we don't just automatically know that. You would think that suntanning and swimming is fun, but in fact, it was something that was learned 100 years ago by certain people, thanks to these Murphys. So if we have that idea of invention, I now sort of want to use that as a way to introduce Monte Carlo, the subject of my book, as Cindy said. And Monte Carlo is indeed the first casino resort in the world. It's 100 years, really, give or take, before Vegas. And there's also the invention there of the idea of a destination that exists as a resort. Okay, the idea of the resort really also originates in Monte Carlo. There's no reason for it to be where it is. There's no underlying economy in Monaco. To put it in terms for New Yorkers, Monaco is about half the size of Central Park. Okay, so it's this little tiny place. You've got these princes, the Grimaldi princes, who've been in power for about 700 years. At the time we're now talking the mid-19th century. And they've always maintained their independence of this little tiny principality, even while all sorts of other places of that size are getting absorbed into France and absorbed into Italy as all the great nation building projects get underway. Monaco somehow survives. And through various rascally and devious ways that I can't really get into given the time. But what happens by 1855, 1860, we're talking around this time, Monaco's prince is nearing bankruptcy, and it looks like they're going to get absorbed into France. And they want to avoid that. So what the prince's advisor comes up with is the idea that they can legalize gambling. The one asset they have, since they have no natural assets, is the ability to set their own laws. And so they can legalize gambling, and within 24 hours of the decree, become the only place for hundreds of miles in Europe where people could play cards or dice legally without fear of social reprisal or legal reprisal, because it was seen as a sort of sin and a moral, that it was a dangerous practice. Gambling took place privately or in certain spa towns in Germany, but not down in the West and not down in the South of Europe. So Monaco is on the map in a sense, as this gambling place, but there's nothing there, right? So it takes another decade until a French entrepreneur named Francois Blanc has enough money and comes along and is going to build up Monte Carlo. He takes an empty swath of land. He names it Monte Carlo for the reigning Prince Charles. And he says this is going to be a casino resort. Francois Blanc is a total huckster. He's a self-made guy. He was a card sharp. He manipulated stocks in his favor, a criminal in a sense. But he had some good ideas and he had some money. And so he founds this idea of Monte Carlo. And what he does that's so ingenious for the time is he says, the story of this place that I'm going to tell through the media is going to be more important than the reality. So I'm going to invent the idea that Monte Carlo is the height of luxury, even while there's nothing there. And that simply by coming here, and this is right at the tipping point of railway travel, making places accessible, simply by coming here, if you have the means to get here and gamble, you will become a member of a certain cosmopolitan elite. You will meet people, he's trying to appeal to the aristocracy and to the wealthy bourgeois who want to mimic aristocratic practices. And that gambling, yes, of course, we're going to gamble, that's fine. And gambling's going to pay for everything. But it's seen as an aside. You're not really there to gamble. You're here to be in this resort lifestyle. So the first people come and they're very disappointed because they've heard all this great stuff about Monte Carlo and there's nothing there. There's a casino. But eventually, enough people come and start to lose enough money that Blanc has a bit of a nest egg and he takes every single bit of money that comes in through the casino and he puts it into infrastructure to try and make the city live up to its reputation. So he builds all sorts of things that have nothing to do with gambling. He builds a thermal spa, he builds a race course for horses, he builds an opera house, a grand hotel. And eventually the place does look even more glamorous, let's say, than the story he wanted to tell. And that's really why Monte Carlo is, in a sense, historically interesting, because it is that point of if you build it, they will come, and that you can have a town whose, and even indeed a nation, if you want to say that about Monaco, whose reason for being is in a sense to tell a story, and that people will come and live that story and make it so, in a sense. People do come and it is glamorous, especially the aristocracy. They do come because they feel comfortable there. The gambling is, of course, a very big part of it, but it's the theatricality of this gambling. The way that they design the space, the casino, and indeed the entire town, is to be seen and to see and be seen, right? There's a lot of great dramatic overhead lighting, big open spaces, big round tables. A lot of the looks that you now see in places like Las Vegas originate with Monte Carlo, with the architecture of this casino, so that it mimicked the sense of being almost at court for these members of the aristocracy and for the people who want to mimic them. And that goes really, really well for several decades. The Grimaldi family, the generations of the princes, are a majority shareholder in this casino, although they're always silent partners, they're in the background, but they amass an immense amount of wealth that we now measure at possibly $10 billion or more, exclusively from gambling. The gambling is completely paid for by outsiders because the Monegasques themselves are forbidden from entering the casino unless for work. It's completely funded by outsiders in the sense of this French entrepreneur has built it and now the gambling losses are building up the city. And its entire livelihood depends on foreigners, on people from outside, right? And that makes it unique among the world. And it's no coincidence, I think, that Monaco also becomes the world's first tax haven. It's for that same amount, that same reason. They can set whatever laws they want, they can do what they want there. And there's the idea that you can come to this place and live in a way that's not really how you would live at home, and that's okay. It's not only acceptable, it's glamorous. There's a sense of the invention in Monte Carlo that a cosmopolitan identity, an identity that transcends the nation is something to be envied and is something that is inherently glamorous. So as I said, that goes really well until the First World War. And the First World War, demographically speaking, really destroys a lot of the clientele in the fact that they die in the war, but also drains finances from a lot of the clientele. And there's that whole world disappears in a sense with the fall of Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Revolution. A lot of that Eastern and Central European clientele has been decimated. And sort of the idea of aristocracy and an aristocratic style is now out of fashion as well. So not only are they struggling financially, they're also just struggling to keep up with the times and tell the right story. So their profits by 1925, which is the earliest I could kind of see profit sheets after the war when I did my research, were down to about a third of what they were before the war. So they're really in tough times. So the question then is, how does these New Yorkers on a beach in Antibes and Monaco in tough times in the 20s connect? They connect through a woman named Elsa Maxwell, another American. So really this is a story of Monte Carlo, but really a story of America and American innovation. Elsa Maxwell is a great character. And if you ever need a Halloween costume in the future, look her up, because she is a larger than life, irrepressible figure and quite an impressive woman. So Elsa Maxwell gets summoned in 1926 to meet Prince Pierre, who is the younger generation. He's not in power, his dad's in power. He's actually Grace Kelly's father-in-law, okay, to put it in perspective, or will be, not at this point. And he's forward thinking, and he's trying to rescue Monaco from its doldrums. And so he calls Elsa Maxwell to lunch. Now, the fact that a European prince is talking to an American woman and asking her opinion about anything is quite revolutionary at the time, or at least unusual. But Elsa Maxwell was a very unusual woman. So who was she? She was many things. She was a theater impresario, a writer, a journalist, a press agent, a society hostess, and above all, I think she was a public relations guru. Europeans in the 1920s didn't have the concept of public relations. It just didn't exist in Europe as a business. The fact that you would need to pay somebody to promote your brand or your destination just wasn't done. There was sort of advertising, but there was not a PR or press agent working for you. So she kind of invents that, or sort of introduces that concept to the Europeans. She makes her name, first of all, as a party planner in Paris. She was great at it. She was a storyteller above all. Her point, I think, that all she did throughout her career was to say, what story do people want to hear, and how can I tell it to them, and how can I entertain them? It didn't really matter how she told it. She told it in a lot of different ways and through a lot of different jobs, but she always made sure that people left entertained. And so she did that originally with these great parties in Paris on the eve of the First World War. So what she did, for instance, was she would run the party backwards, was an idea of hers. So you would show up and she would serve you dessert, and it would go, and she would say goodbye, and it would go backwards from there, and you'd end with hors d'oeuvres and saying hello. She once served a fish course and had trained seals coming out and clapping as the fish arrived. She actually invented the idea of the treasure hunt. The treasure hunt originates with Elsa Maxwell. All of these things were to bring people together and loosen them up. The aristocracy loved it because they lived these very stuffy, buttoned-down lives, and they felt that around her, especially because she was so brash herself and sometimes vulgar, they could let their guard down. And so she was great at mixing classes and mixing worlds. If you've ever done this, you know from hosting your own dinner parties, who you sit next to each other is an art. And she was great at that. She would find the most devilish person and sit them next to the stuffiest person, and the sparks would fly. And she kind of parlayed that into working for destinations, destination marketing, we now call it. Her first client was Venice. And she, if you've ever been to the Lido, that is an Elsa Maxwell invention. She tried to, she was approached by the mayor of Venice to bring Americans to that city, which until the 1920s was not very popular with Americans. She kind of loosened it up, made it a bit sportier, and invented this Lido. It was actually meant to appeal to middle-class American clients in its original incantation. So she's summoned to Monaco with the idea that she'll maybe do the same thing. So this Prince Pierre asks her, Elsa, what are we doing wrong? Why are we failing? I mean, we're Monte Carlo. At this point, they're legendary. She says, you're not paying homage to the new king. And this prince says, well, who's the new king? She says, the Sun King. And she elaborates. The Sun King is now in charge. The summer is the future. And she's playing, in a sense, off of that original idea of Monte Carlo, which is that everything that's not the casino is going to be your greatest asset for attracting a clientele. In this case, it's the Mediterranean right in front of you that nobody is making use of. Monte Carlo is essentially a ghost town like the rest of the Riviera in the summer. And so her idea is stay open throughout the summer and sell yourselves as a summer destination. So you're going to host an annual tennis tournament, which they do, golfing, sporting events. There's going to be a new casino called the Summer Sporting Casino. And she wants new hotels that are more casual in a sense and more sunny and sun oriented. This new casino, she wants to have an open roof, for instance. And the prince balks at this idea and the costs involved. And she kind of confronts him with a very American maxim, which would be familiar to any of her peers, but certainly would sound like something bizarre to a European prince, which is you have to spend money to make money. And eventually she convinces the powers that be that this is going to rescue Monaco, her plan for the summer. And it sort of works in a sense. She realizes that Monte Carlo, if it's a story, is locked in the wrong genre. It's kind of Victorian romance. There's chandeliers and white tablecloths and silverware and all that. She wants it to move toward adventure. The big films of the 1920s, Tarzan, Ben-Hur, Zorro. Those are, I believe, the three biggest films of the 1920s, or at least in the top 5. That's what people want. They want adventure. They want to escape the trauma that they've gone through and see travel as a form of risk-taking, in a sense, of breeziness, of easiness, and adventure. So the epitome of her design is encapsulated in a building called the Monte Carlo Beach Hotel, which is still there. Now, there's 2 things you should know about the Monte Carlo Beach Hotel. First of all, it's not in Monte Carlo. It's not even in Monaco. It's actually in France, in Roquebrune, which is the small town just to the east of Monaco, because it's got a nice little crescent piece of shoreline and a nice flat tableland. So the people in Monaco buy that land, build this Monte Carlo Beach Hotel on French soil. It's facing toward the ocean and away from the traditional seat of power, which is the casino and the Hotel de Paris, right in the middle of town. This is off on the edge. It's Somerville in a sense. The other thing you need to know about the Monte Carlo Beach Hotel is that there's no beach. At least there wasn't in the beginning. There might be a little one now. Elsa Maxwell came up with this idea that they would have a rubber beach. They would lay down some rubber and then pour sand on it, and that would be a makeshift beach, which never came to fruition because it was a sort of engineering disaster. But the press loved it, and for years and years, you'll see press reports of the rubber beach, like as if it did exist. People just willed it into existence because it was such a great idea. It never actually happened. But what they did do was build an Olympic-sized swimming pool right at the edge of the ocean, which people at the time thought was absolutely nuts. But today, with an infinity pool next to water is ubiquitous, and it starts actually with this Monte Carlo Beach Hotel. And then in a final bit of irony, the hotel, the beach hotel, is now the epitome of stuffiness. It is really expensive. It is really, in a sense, the opposite of Elsa's original vision. It has a 3-star Michelin restaurant as its big calling card, and the name of that restaurant is the Elsa. So you kind of come full circle in a sense that the story outruns itself. So there we have some stories about Monte Carlo from the 20s and the Riviera, the invention, and then the reinvention. So the question is, why do I care, and why should you care? Aside from just the anecdotal value and that it's lovely to think about this time. To me, why I was interested in Monaco and why I think it bears investigation is it's really a celebration of the idea of cosmopolitanism. Now you can say this is just crass commercialism, this is just to make a buck, and that this is just for privileged people, but I think it's something more than that. I think that there's an idea here that they started with a free space, a space where people could come and say, meeting people who are different from me in terms of their national background and their class, there's a mixing of class, there's a mixing of outlooks. You have even enemies or former enemies meeting in the casino and the hotel. Something new will come out of that. And that transcends Monaco, that goes all along the Riviera, and I think speaks to why this place, especially in the 1920s, has currency today and feels glamorous. It's not just Coco Chanel and the sun and the clothes and all of that natural beauty, which is fantastic and should be exciting and alluring. I think there's a sense of something created and something new being created there in this open space. That travel, that interaction, that cosmopolitanism, that an international outlook is something that's not dangerous, but is actually something worthy in and of itself. Somebody who is, I'm Jewish and I also study European history, okay? So I have no shortage of stories to tell or events that I've seen where peoples who are seen as rootless or traveling are regarded with fear and loathing, right? This idea that the wandering Jew, the peddler, the vagabond, the so-called gypsy, vagrants, migrant workers today, the people who have no roots are inherently people to be distrusted, and that the solution to that is to build walls and to sort of look inward. And I think that in a sense, Monte Carlo offers us another route, not one without problems, but one with possibilities, this idea of these spaces in the Riviera where people can meet and try to reinvent themselves, try to tell each other stories, and that ideally and theoretically anybody is invited so long as you're interesting. So I'm really welcoming your questions. And I guess my final thing I want to say is, if you should find yourself fortunate enough to get to Monaco, we all hope that one day we will be traveling soon, and you find yourself there and somebody is trying to hold it up as the epitome of European elegance, of old world living, of tradition and refinement, you can tell them, no. Monte Carlo is all about openness, and it's actually in many ways an American invention, and that if it owes its survival to anybody, it is actually, I think, two Americans, two New Yorkers on a beach in Antibes in 1922. Thank you.
Are you saying it's an homage to the Murphys? Because I think you're right. I get it.
That's nice to hear. Let me get to speaker view so I can see who's talking. And is that okay, Melissa, if people just kind of throw their questions at me?
I came in, so I'm fully in, but I came in not as, so I did sign up for Harmonie. I'm a member of Harmonie, but somehow I'm not up there, and I'm not worthy of my actual video.
Okay.
But I'm authentic. So I just want to say, I can't believe what information you gave us about this.
Well, that's lovely to hear. Thank you so much.
But is it not an American invention then? Did we say that?
I think that it took, and you see this across Europe in the 20th century, especially after the First World War, it took American ingenuity and American entrepreneurial energy to revitalize a lot of places in Europe, which isn't to say that the Europeans wouldn't have found it themselves, but the Americans who were there were there in the right place at the right time with the right idea. There was just a bigger cultural baggage in Europe that it was sort of untoward. It wasn't done to be that aggressive as an entrepreneur at the high levels of society. You were supposed to sort of just, that aristocratic detachment, right? One doesn't get one's hands dirty in business like that. And I think that places were suffering, and that it was, in this case and in others, I think, a revitalization, let's say. So maybe not an American invention, from beginning to end, but certainly I think that the Riviera as a space owes a lot to the Americans and American ingenuity.
Can I add to what Mark's saying?
Please.
Mark was speaking about the cosmopolitan atmosphere. Monaco only has 38 to 39,000 inhabitants, and only 8,000 of them hold the nationality. The inhabitants of Monaco represent people coming from over 139 different countries.
And gambling now. Sorry, go ahead.
The which is a hotel now, is where the Murphys and Fitzgerald stayed.
The Hotel du Cap.
So you know what? I was very interested in your statement. I thought it was so brilliant. Joel and I were watching this without the video because we looked that horrible. Anyway, we had other things going on right now. But Joel and I have been to Hotel du Cap maybe 7 times. And it's been something incredibly glorious in our lives. But those guys just really don't know what to do to thieve from the Americans. And we respond because we want the best. We want everything. And by the way, I have a question for you. So how did the Murphys from Hotel du Cap find a beautiful beach? Because every time you go to Hotel du Cap in the world now, I mean, in the modern world, you're way up high. They have, and by the way, they have these very low chaises. It's no one under 25 can get into these chaises. Or if you do, they have to pick you up 2 days later. You know this? Anyway, so just to say, how did Hotel du Cap become the middle? I'm shocked. I mean, I love that place.
This is one of the great ironies of the Riviera, especially for the first time visitor. When you discover it's not the greatest beaches in the world. There are patches that
not the great,
what we would consider lovely beaches, but you know, there's a lot of pebbly beaches, and it is, as you say, there's a lot of cliffs, right? And Monaco in particular suffered from that. There's no natural beachfronts whatsoever in that entire place. So it was, how do you make that happen? And I think the Hotel du Cap, you know, they have their pool on the edge there, and the Murphys, I think they just happened upon 20 feet of, as I said before, seaweed and debris covered sand, and they made it. In a sense, they raked it with the help of the fishermen, and it was just them and the fishermen. So the fishermen have places that they can get to, the low-lying ground at sea level, where they can set their skiffs off. Whether that was thought of as a beach, no, it wasn't. Nobody went to the beach for pleasure. So that was, again, this idea of something that had to be created. And the Hotel du Cap today is very different from what it was back then, of course. I mean, I guess that's an understatement. But I appreciate the question of the geography, and I think it's vital to that history. It's another story. You hear about beaches, and then you get there, and it's sort of hit and miss with the beaches in a sense. Although the Mediterranean is undeniably lovely.
I think I remember them being very rocky.
Right.
I went once when I was 16, and I was like, "This is kind of worse than the South Shore beaches I go to now." But
I don't think so.
I mean, believe me, the location and destination and all the glitz and glamour was far better than the beaches I attend now. But the beach itself was a little rocky. I had to wear my sandals into the ocean, which I don't do on the South Shore.
Contributing.
So
sorry,
Mark Braude, I have a question for you.
Please.
I was expecting a lot of film. I want to see who the Murphys were, who Cole Porter's wife was. And none of that happened. And I in the first 12 minutes, I'm going like, I'm totally bummed over this. And in fact, you turn out to be the most spectacular expert. Thank you so much.
Well, this is.
So tell me, do you have any video? You have any photographs?
Yeah, so this is the thing of a Zoom call. If I was there in person with you, I would have my PowerPoint and my film reels, and this is what makes it so the challenge. And I guess it related to the book, in fact, in that my book, I specifically said to the publisher, I don't want any pictures. I wanted to see.
I got that.
Maybe a dumb idea, I don't know, but I wanted to see if I could tell the story through words, because these days people can find the pictures. But in this case, for a talk, it would have been lovely, because it is a visual story, not just as a reflection, not just here's some pretty images that help to tell the story, but because the visual is so important. The way, especially the Murphys, are presenting themselves is vital, okay? There's a sort of, you just see it in their posture. These are athletic people and carefree in the way they hold themselves and how they dress. It's elegant without trying to be. It's all about movement. They want to exercise, they want to move about freely. They want to wear linens because it sort of works for them, and it ends up just looking fabulous. And Coco Chanel, who rolls with this crowd, I think picks up on that. She has her own ideas. Of course, I'm not trying to take anything away from her, but I think she sees that there's a sort of elegance there. There's an Italian word that you might know. It's called sprezzatura. I'm probably mangling it, but it's this courtly art of pretending like you don't care when really it's deeply calculated. It's a calculated sort of carefreeness, if that makes sense. Who's the guy from Fiat? Agnelli, right? The patriarch of that business.
Agnelli?
Right. He wore these like two watches, like as if he'd forgotten that he had two watches. And he was always like a slightly disheveled in his beautiful suits. And it was this sense of sprezzatura, of kind of effortless glamour and elegance that was actually from an older history of courtiers trying to disarm their enemies in a way. And I don't think that the Murphys were very cunning in the regard, but I think they were practicing sprezzatura, whether they knew it or not, a sort of carefreeness that can't help but being elegant and enviable, just because they carry themselves so freely in what they're wearing and how they're looking. So you're absolutely right that the visual is a key to this story.
So can you send any of yours?
Well, I have a giant PowerPoint file, so let me see with.
If you want me to circulate it to the membership after, I'd be happy to do so. So as a little.
Sure. Let me track that down.
Gathering follow-up.
With great pleasure.
I would be so wild about this, although I have to say, I think I said it before. I was expecting a whole video presentation, film and photos, and didn't happen. I'm sitting here for about 10 minutes going like, what happened? And then I go, oh my God, this is an explosion. You are so knowledgeable. You did it by yourself. I didn't need anything else, but I would not mind seeing.
Thank you. That's very sweet.
We're using our imagination this evening, but then.
And I have to say, Mark has wonderful images to support the incredible stories that he shared with you tonight.
Which I'll send.
It
Guys,
sounds
tell
like
me.
maybe, I'm sorry, this is Davina speaking. It sounds like maybe we need a follow-up event with the visuals. So
With great pleasure.
It sounds like there's been a great interest in what you've been saying, and it seems like a sequel is in order.
Can I ask you guys a quick question? Is MoMA open? Can we get into MoMA in New York?
How you mean
Go
physically there?
Yeah.
I go physically.
I don't know. But
By reservation.
they do have, when you feel comfortable going, they do have an exquisite painting by Gerald Murphy. I think it's called Wasp and Pear. Gerald Murphy is like a really brilliant painter. He does these great modernist pieces, and he's hanging out with some giants and learning from them.
But his father could not have liked him for this.
No, and he only paints. We only have 12 paintings, so we don't. It's he's a mysterious figure. Whether he was a dilettante or whether he was actually quite brilliant and sort of just stifled in some way. They came to a very difficult end, the Murphys, in a sense that they lost their children quite young, which is quite tragic. And I think that after that, this frivolity and this style of life really no longer appealed, and they sort of retired in a sense from that life. And I want to say Sag Harbor maybe is where they ended up living, and their neighbor happened to be
Never got to own a house of her parents?
The brownstone on 11th. No, I think I don't know what happened to the brownstone on 11th or the great mansion on East Hampton. They happened to have a neighbor, Calvin Tompkins, who's a brilliant writer for the New Yorker, who just like, I guess they were out gardening and sort of got to know them and heard this story. Oh, I heard that you knew the Fitzgeralds back in the 20s, and this whole history came pouring out of them. And he wrote this brilliant book in the 70s called Living Well is the Best Revenge. It's a great read if you can find it. It's maybe 150 pages. Calvin Tompkins, all about Gerald and Sarah Murphy and this time that I'm talking about. It's just fantastic.
Thank you so much, Mark. We have a few questions in the chat section. Some of them I think you touched upon.
Okay.
So I see one that states, I find what you said about the influence of the Spanish flu pandemic on the way people were living in the 20s very interesting. And I wonder what lifestyle changes will come following the current scenario. Maybe we can have a follow-up event with the visuals, which we already on.
Okay. I'd love to speak. Okay, so one of the great pleasures of being a historian is that I get to live in the past and I get to escape there. And I don't really predict the future with great insight, but I can sort of, my wife always says I have this sort of calming influence when it comes to difficulties, because I can point to somewhere in the past where it was like that happened and then it got better. You know, things happen in cycles. And I do think that I'm not going to be glib about the so-called Spanish flu. Estimates I think are somewhere between 9 million and 20 million dead across the world. I'm not, you know, I can't downplay the trauma that would have, you know, inflicted on people and how that changed how people live. But I think that something did come out of that, which was in the air maybe already, between that and the war, which was a sense that the things that we might have held important and valuable to begin with all got put into question, for good or for ill. And I think mostly for good. So there was a sense that a lot of the changes in traditions and repression of people and how they wanted to live start to kind of unwind in the 20s out of this trauma. There's a sense of questioning everything, because now it's the sense of what we want to do is live, and we want to live as brightly and intensely as we can. And so that means sort of making your own way, making your own ideas about how you're going to get value out of life. It's no longer trying to please, you know, sort of generations above you and trying to live up to social standards of the time. I think people are sort of making it up as they go along. And that's really, again, this idea of the short hair and the flapper, that's a sort of, it's a rejection of everything that comes before. And it's an embrace of a kind of freer lifestyle. And I think that, you know, things will be put up for question as well. What has been guiding us? What have we been living for? And do we want to continue living for those things in the same way? I don't know, but I think that certainly just asking those kinds of questions is inherently valuable.
One last question for me personally is that I love that period. I love that time period. I respect everybody. I wish I was part of it. I wish I was the tail end of it, but maybe because I'm Jewish, I never could have been. That is my dream of dreams. But what is like that today? Where is that today? Does it exist?
Well, this is the question, is can you have that sort of physical spot these days when everything seems so virtual and so much creativity happens online? People might have said Berlin at a certain point had some of that, at least in my generation. I'm 42. And sort of in my 20s, that was the place you went to because it felt free. Certainly not Paris because it was too expensive. So it was a place of like, do you have a big city where lots of people can go, where there's a thriving art scene and it's affordable? Something will come of that, whether that's going to be, and maybe Brooklyn had a bit of that, obviously, right? But the question that I think you touched on is really kind of sad and beautiful in its own way of Jewish identity. You know, it's not at all in my story that I've just told, but Jews in Paris, for instance, in the 20s play significant roles in changing the culture. The painters of the Paris school, a lot of them are Jewish, a lot of them are Russian. And I'm writing a book now about Kiki de Montparnasse and Man Ray, who is also Jewish, in Paris in the 20s. And
Are you saying Man Ray was Jewish?
Man Ray is Jewish, yes.
Oh, I can't believe it.
Born in Philadelphia, and then they moved to Brooklyn. They lived in Bed-Stuy. I have his bar mitzvah picture, which I can send to you, actually.
That's so hilarious.
It's a very cute picture. But so I love this period in the same way that you do, but it is kind of scary because I think to myself, okay, say I was in my 20s, in the roaring 20s in Paris as a Jewish person, I would have had all that fun. But what would have happened to me, mathematically speaking, what very likely would have happened to me is I would have been 40 by the time it was 1940. And if I was in Paris, there's a very good likelihood I would have been sent to Drancy, which was the gateway from France to the camps. And so that's, you know, I kind of keep that, and that might be the ending of my book that I'm working on now. It's deeply troubling to think about that all of this freedom and all of this openness and all of this beauty, you know, 10 years later, here was those same people, a lot of the people that I've been writing about ended up in the camps.
Wow.
Can I add a piece
Wow,
of
thanks for that revelation.
Can I add a piece of trivia? So we were speaking about Jewish identity and Americans. So Grace Kelly was not the first American princess in Monaco. There was another one who preceded her, and she happened to have been Jewish.
That's true.
Her name was Elise Heine. She was New Orleanian, although the family had settled in New Orleans. They were a financial family, and she married Prince Albert I. The marriage did not end successfully. They separated, which was kind of unusual, and she was a big supporter, of Dreyfus.
Correct.
And if you visit New Orleans today, you can see the home in which she was born. And the current Prince Albert II, had made a trip to New Orleans and put up a plaque at the site of the birth of Alice Heine.
Yes, Prince Albert I was deeply philanthropic. I'm not going to say that the Grimaldi should be held up as saints, but he was very involved in world affairs and on the right side of history. And a lot of Dreyfus's defense, I think that he helped to fund that because of Alice Heine. So you're absolutely right.
We're going to say he was not an anti-Semite, Grace Kelly's husband.
Yeah, I'm not too fond of that Renier from what it's hard. Listen,
Yeah, it's very hard.
When you do
I agree.
history, I had like letters from Grace Kelly where she was pregnant and she's writing to her friend in America about her pregnancy. You know what I mean? And I'm looking at that, this is in her handwriting, and it's kind of crazy. It's like, this is somebody's marriage. It's hard enough to kind of figure out your own marriage in a sense and what
Totally.
you're thinking. And I'm trying to kind of hear these strangers to me, and they're dead as well. These are ghosts that I'm dealing with. So all that aside, yes, I do think that Renier had some very, let's say, unfriendly views towards a lot of people, I think, including the Jews.
Yeah.
And the Monaco history in World War II is very, very murky. I wasn't allowed to look at any archives from the Second World War.
Wow.
In Monaco.
Perhaps today some additional materials will be available to you, because Prince Albert did apologize for certain actions in Monaco's position during World War II. Monaco was occupied by the Germans during World War II.
Correct. And again, sorry not to monopolize, but the current Albert, I think, is very much like Albert I in that idea of he wants to be open. He wants to say that, look, this is not a perfect place, but we will try to proceed with openness. That wasn't available to me. This was about, 14 years ago, 12 years ago when I started doing that research. I found out a lot of great stuff from the Library of Congress, a lot of declassified files in Baltimore as well. Sorry, I'm getting on a tangent, but there's a lot of, the US is very interested in what Monaco was doing in the Second World War and afterwards, with that idea of repatriation of funds and artworks that were looted by the occupying Italian.
If I can add something to that, an anecdote, as Cindy knows, I've done a lot of work in Monte Carlo, and during World War II, as you said, when the Germans were there, the staff of the Hotel de Paris moved very swiftly, and anything that was of value, including the most amazing collection of wines. The Hotel de Paris is built on solid rock, and their wine cellar is, as you may know, in the rock underneath. There are steps down. I've done a tour of it from their head sommelier. And what he told us was that before the Germans arrived, they were able to move their most valuable bottles of wine all the way into the back part of this huge wine cellar. And they then walled it up along with all sorts of other things that they obviously didn't want the Germans to find. And they walled up half the wine cellar, put cases of wines that they didn't care about in front of it, and it was never found. And after World War II, they were able to go back in, take down the false walls, and now it's open. You can do tours through it. You can have dinners in the wine cellar and see all this amazing space. And there are some bottles that they've kept for posterity just to show what they did.
That's fantastic. Where were you when I was writing my book? That would have been a whole chapter.
I was probably in Monte Carlo.
Right.
So I'm reading through. So Michelle had some nice comments and posted a photo from the MoMA. Manuel Radinsky was given his name. That is Man Ray. A picture of a Wasserman pear. Does anyone else have any questions? I know I'm going down a whole visual of myself in Monaco right now and having some, I was only there briefly as a teenager, but having some flashbacks to that summer, and it's quite delightful for a rainy Monday night in New York City. So thank you very much, Mr. Braude.
Cheers.
Mark, do you have any little ghost story, perhaps a personality
Oh,
of the 20s or 30s?
Sure. So I don't know if it's from the 20s or 30s, but Monte Carlo, there's a spooky side to Monte Carlo that I guess we could get into in honor of Halloween. We should. There's, in my research, I found all of these stories, press reports of suicide in Monte Carlo. It was this pervasive story that kept getting told again and again. Sometimes you could see it was a fabrication just really clearly, although it was in a French newspaper. That was sort of something that happened a lot in the 19th centuries. They would just tell a good story and put it in the paper and pass it off as news. And then at the very bottom, they would be like, no, this is a canard, this is a little lark. And then some factual. So it was kind of interesting to separate the rumors from the truth, but there was always this pervasive sense that Monte Carlo was inherently dangerous, that it would separate, it would break up families, it would lead men toward ruin and women toward prostitution, and there was all sorts of stories of fallen people in Monte Carlo. And I think that, of course, that has something to do with gambling and the public perception to gambling, but I think it also has to speak to this idea of cosmopolitanism, of this idea of a place where all sorts of different people mix. It seems like the natural setting for a cabal of people who plan the war, for instance. So there are these novels around the First World War of secret meetings in Monaco, which was neutral to keep the war going for profits. It's also, the setting for a James Bond villain. Now, James Bond, interestingly enough, in the novels, never sets foot in Monte Carlo, ever. Casino Royale is actually set in a fictional French town in the north of France called, Deauville, I can't remember. It's based on Deauville. But when the movie comes along, here's a visual story for you. It seems fitting that he's going to be among the villains of Monaco. And so I kept seeing all these stories of suicide and people, somebody who would lose everything and take out a revolver and shoot themselves on the table. And people would come to look for the suicide the suicide's grave in Monte Carlo, which doesn't exist. And stories of people being buried with, thrown into the ocean with rocks and their money stuffed with bills to make it look like they didn't kill themselves because they'd lost money because they have money in their pockets, and then shipped off to Nice. So the body would wash up ashore and not be Monte Carlo's problem. So I don't know if that's like necessarily spooky, but there was the sense of danger and death being associated with this place from the very beginning that I think kind of translates all the way through to the 20th century. And I think, again, inherently tied to the idea of movement. I'll do one more thing and then I'll stop talking. But it's a great one. There's this case of a true story of a woman who ends up dismembered and discovered in a train station in various pieces of luggage in Marseille. And the crime was committed in Monaco. And it was a kind of robbery for money and then a murder to try and cover up the robbery. But the press, it's a big splashy illustrated front page of the Paris Weekly Illustrated. We're talking about 1910 when the story comes out. And I think it gains traction not simply because of the grisliness of the murder, but because of that discovery. It's in a train station. The woman murdered was somebody who was away from her home and her family and had come to Monaco for pleasure. and somebody found her and took advantage of her and robbed her and killed her. And it's again, all of these moving parts of, if you stray far from home, if you go to this place where all sorts of different people can meet, that is inherently putting yourself at risk and dangerous.
So
It sounds like Monte Carlo was the original Sin City before
Exactly.
Las Vegas.
Right. All of those
Wow.
things.
So I think that we could all just close our eyes and pretend now, since you gave us all the visuals and the history, and just pretend that we're in Monte Carlo this Monday. So thank you so, so much, Mark. And thank you, Cindy, for sponsoring. That was such a fabulous and fun evening. And we're so happy to have you here on the screen and look forward to all being together again soon. Until then, we're traveling virtually.
There you go. Thank you so much for having me. It was really lovely. I feel very welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you for having joined us.
Cheers. Be well.
Good night.